Be seated, thank you. Mr. Gray, your continued direct, please.
Let's start back. Would you tell the jury what you base your findings of accidental gunshot? What you base that opinion on?
The factors that I used to come to that opinion?
Yeah.
Given the circumstances of Mr. Fleischauer being found with a gunshot wound, I then went on to consider the other factors surrounding his wound and his death. To begin with, he was significantly, I'd say, severely intoxicated at the time. The post-mortem blood alcohol concentration of Chase Fleichauer was a 0.278. That's a substantially elevated blood alcohol concentration, one that I would expect to result in impairment of judgment and impairment of fine motor skills or fine motor use of his digits. Given that, we have a gunshot wound to the forehead that has evidence of being at a close to intermediate range. There was test firing of the gun done, and the test firing at roughly 5 to 6 inches was very consistent with the findings on the actual gunshot wound itself. So we have a gunshot wound to the forehead at a distance that is close enough to be self-inflicted, although in contrast, it is not the type of gunshot wound I would expect for a suicide. Those are almost always contact gunshot wounds where the muzzle of the gun is touching the skin surface at the time it's discharged. So we have a wound that's consistent with being self-inflicted. We have a decedent, Mr. Chase Fleichauer, who at the time was highly intoxicated. We have a gunshot wound that's consistent with him in that state, looking at the barrel of the gun from a fairly close distance. We have his intoxicated state in terms of his impairment that would render him more susceptible to an accidental discharge under those conditions. I further have the recoil testing of the gun done by Mr. Burton, and I've reviewed those videos, indicating that that weapon, if not held very tightly, could easily recoil and be projected over some significant distance. So the purported finding of the gun not being directly with or underneath him is not inconsistent with a self-inflicted accidental gunshot wound. And then I subsequently was informed as to laboratory testing that is also relevant. We have DNA from Mr. Chase Fleischauer found on the gun and nobody else. We have gunshot residues on the hands of Mr. Chase Fleischauer and not on other occupants of the house. So the totality of those circumstances of an intoxicated person holding a gun and probably looking at the muzzle all are consistent with the circumstances and the testing that I've just summarized for you. To the contrary, as I said, this gunshot wound does not have the appearance that suggests a suicide, an intentional self-inflicted wound, but rather an accidental one. But in addition to all of those factors, I have no other facts or factors derived from the investigation, the autopsy, the laboratory testing, that indicates to me that he was shot by another. So in other words, I have no evidence specifically that would tell me this was a homicide.
And what does a homicide, what does that mean?
We're talking about the context of a manner of death. And in that context, the manner of death of homicide means that somebody has died from an injury received at the hands of another person.
And let's move on to, you also reviewed the autopsy regarding prior injuries.
Yes, sir.
And you're aware of the Dr. Mills' testimony that they all happened about the same time?
Yes, I am.
Is that accurate?
From a medical standpoint, no, it is not.
And why do you say that?
If you look at the prior injuries, the other injuries besides the gunshot wound, indeed they all do look to be fresh or acute. However, from a strictly medical standpoint, those fresh appearing injuries could have happened seconds before death, minutes before death, hours before death. Some of those injuries are, again, from a strictly medical or pathological standpoint, consistent with having happened up to as much as a day before death. So the fact that they all look to be quote-unquote fresh doesn't limit them medically to have occurred at or about the same time. They could have all occurred at about the same time prior to death, but the medical evidence doesn't permit a conclusion that they did occur at the same time.
And those superficial injuries, in a medical opinion, would they be consistent with somebody hitting a hard floor?
Objection to the form of the question assumes the fact not necessary.
Sustained.
Okay. Assume hypothetically that somebody was aggressively wrestling prior to the gunshot wound. Would those injuries be consistent with that?
Objection, foundation.
Well, assuming those facts to be true, Doctor, and ladies and gentlemen, I've instructed you on your use of hypothetical questions, and you're to consider the opinions only if you accept and believe the assumed facts. If they are in evidence, the doctor can answer.
Yes, they are, sir.
And let's move on to the pre-existing fractures. You're aware from her testimony, you've read her transcript, is that right?
Yes, sir. Her being Dr. Mills?
Yes, Dr. Mills from last week, you've
Yes,
read
sir.
what she testified to?
Yes, sir.
And you've also read her autopsy?
Yes, sir.
And let's deal first with the temporal bone. Tell the jury what you looked at about the temporal bone.
The temporal bone is one of the locations of many in the skull of Mr. Chase Fleichauer where there were fractures of that bone, and there were fractures that originated from the point of entry of the gunshot wound, and some of them propagated into various areas, one of which was the temporal bone.
And in your opinion, was that temporal bone fracture, did that pre-exist the gunshot wound?
In my opinion, that temporal bone fracture did not pre-exist the gunshot wound. In fact, quite the opposite. It was the direct result of the gunshot wound.
And do you have photos with you that were taken at the autopsy that would prove that or
Yes.
establish that?
Yes, sir. Oops.
Showing you Exhibit 331. Can you identify that, sir?
Yes, sir. You've handed me marked Exhibit 331 is one of the autopsy photographs of Mr. Chase Fleichauer. In particular, it is showing the base of the skull with the head having been opened during the autopsy and the brain removed, and the dura, which is the lining membrane of the cranial cavity, also having been removed. So this is an overall view of that base of the cranial cavity, which does indeed show some of the fractures, including the temporal bone. Just to be clear, we're talking about the left temporal bone.
We'd offer Exhibit 331.
What's the objection? Thank you.
Any objection, Mr. Kaiser?
No.
Received. you're asking to publish, Mr.
Yes,
Gibbons?
Your Honor.
Granted.
Okay.
And if you want to get the light.
Can you, from that photo up there, can you explain to the jury what you're talking about with respect to the temporal bone fracture?
Yes, and can we take the magnification down very slightly, because the top of the photo is cut off, I think.
Yes, that's my fault.
That's good.
That better?
Yes. What you're seeing here, 331 on the screen, is the photo as I described it. You're basically looking down from the top of the head. Mr. Fleischauer is lying face up on the autopsy table, so that the top where the ruler scale is the skull bone at the forehead, down at the bottom is the back of the head, and then left and right on the screen correspond to his left and right. So up at about 11 o'clock, if you take the circumference of the skull as a clock face, is approximately where the entrance gunshot wound was. It's actually up a little above the plane of this, but that's just to get you your orientation.
Can you point that out? Do you have a pointer, Judge? No? If you put your finger down here, could you point to that?
Yes.
Could you
May
come
I?
down here?
Yes, Dr. Arden, you can stand down.
Could you come down and use your finger? Or a pen maybe?
I have a pen.
Yeah, okay.
So, am I walking with you? So we still have the same photo on the screen, and here's my pen showing you up at about 11 o'clock or so is roughly the location of the entrance gunshot wound. It's hard to see in this photo, but we will have a closer one. But in the areas that I'm showing you, left and right, in the front, there are fractures there. Specific to your question, if you go here, I'm going about midway on the left side of the skull. You can see there's some blood there, and in fact, right there where the tip of the pen is, there's more blood. In that area, that's part of the left temporal bone, and in that area, there's fracturing, which I think we can see better in the other closer photo. But what I will represent to you, and the other photo will confirm this, is that fracturing from the entrance area extends through this first area in the upper left, which is called, technically speaking, the left anterior cranial fossa. It crosses this ridge here that I'm showing you as you go toward the back a little bit. And then in this area that's roughly in the middle of the left side that I'm circling, that's called the middle cranial fossa. And the floor of that depression, where I'm showing you now, middle left side, there's some fracturing there, some of which extends all the way to this roughly 8 to 9 o'clock area where I showed you the hemorrhage, and that's part of the temporal bone where there are fractures, and these are all in continuity from the entrance defect.
Okay, so point again where the gunshot wound is on that photo?
The gunshot wound, I'm pointing to you now at about the 11 o'clock position, and the gunshot wound actually is in the bone that would be slightly above, so it's out of the plane here. The circumference of the open skull that I'm circling now with the pen is where a saw has been taken and the top of the skull has been removed, like the skull cap has been removed, so you're now in this photo looking down into the cavity minus the brain. So what I've been telling you is about the 11 o'clock position, and I'm going to demonstrate on my own head here, my own forehead. The 11 o'clock position would be about where I am in the lower left forehead in what you're seeing in the photo. The gunshot wound is actually just slightly above it. It's in the part of the brain that, the part of the skull that was removed in order to take this photo. But it's roughly at that 11 o'clock position.
And could you trace again where that fracture came from?
Starting from that 11 o'clock position where the entrance gunshot wound was, there are fractures that come essentially backwards. As I trace the pen downward in the photograph, I'm going from the front to the back. And they go essentially backwards along the left side, and some of them terminate in that left side where I'm circling now. That's bloodier. That's the left temporal bone. So the fractures come from the entrance area and go toward there and end at the left temporal bone.
So what's your opinion as to whether or not the temporal bone fracture was caused by a gunshot wound or some pre-existing cause?
In my opinion, the left temporal bone fracture was caused by the gunshot wound. It was not pre-existing.
And the wound itself was on the left side of the forehead, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, you sit down. Thank you. We'll show you next, what is marked Exhibit 332.
Yes, sir.
And is that another photo of the skull region, looking down into the skull?
Yes, it is.
Is fair and accurate?
Yes, sir.
And that was from Dr. Mills's photos?
Yes, it is.
We offer Exhibit 332.
Can I see it? Thank you. Okay.
Received. Publication granted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Come down here again, and now I'm going to ask you about the linear fracture. The left ear linear fracture. You're familiar with that?
I am.
And in your opinion, did that fracture happen before the gunshot wound or at the same time?
In my opinion, the so-called linear fracture is also a result of the gunshot wound. If I may point out, this photograph 332 is actually directed at the temporal bone fracture rather than the linear fracture.
So I mixed them up.
This was the continuation of 331.
Okay, those are the two photos you gave me.
Yes, I gave you the two related to the temporal bone. I have two others related to the linear fracture.
Oh, okay, I got mixed up. I'm sorry. So this, let's go back. This is also a photo of the temporal bone.
Yes.
Okay, apologize, you got two photos of the linear fracture you're gonna discuss too, is that
Yes,
right?
sir.
Okay. We just met last night, is that right?
Objection, foundation relevance.
Sustained. Jury will disregard.
Okay, so, this photo is also another photo of the temporal bone, correct?
Yes, sir.
And could you tell the jury about that photo and why you based your opinion that the temporal bone fracture was at the same time as a gunshot?
Yes, this one, 332, is simply a closer up view. I'm circling in the area that was that depression that wasn't the very front of the left side, wasn't the rear. It was the one in the middle. And in fact, that depression that I'm circling here that is closer up in 332 than it was in 331 is indeed called the left middle cranial fossa. And it shows you that there is some fracturing coming from the front, which is up closer to the top here. It shows you clearly the fracture line going through the floor of this depression, terminating in the area of hemorrhage and fracture of the left temporal bone, which was the area I showed you before that was roughly the 9 o'clock area in 331. So this close-up just confirms in better detail what I was showing you as far as the connection from the fractures from the entrance area going down to the left temporal bone.
Okay. So, could we go back to the last photo? What is that?
You placed it right.
Oh, okay. So would it be helpful to you if you could now show the photo that I mixed up here?
I don't think this is the one you mixed up, but just to emphasize very briefly, 331 on the screen again, I'm circling the area in the middle of the left side. That is the area that was in the close-up in 332 that showed you definitively the fracture going across there, coming from the area of the entrance and ending up in the temporal bone.
Thank you, Doctor. Now, with respect, now that we've dealt with the temporal bone, with respect to the linear fracture, do you have photographs for that too?
I do.
May I have those? I have to mark.
Yes, sir.
And before we get to these, when the gunshot wound went through the forehead, what happened with the bullet?
The bullet itself fragmented. There were a few fragments trapped in the area right around the entrance wound. There were other fragments, one major fragment in particular that was found in the left rear where the majority of that bullet had actually gone through the brain, impacted the left rear of the skull, had punched the bone a little bit, causing a fracture that made like a little depression from the inside, but didn't perforate through the bone. So the bullet major fragments remained in the left rear area and were recovered at the autopsy.
And I'm going to show you exhibits 334 and 333, and ask you to look at both of those. Are
Yes,
those
sir.
photos from Dr. Knowles' autopsy?
Yes, they are.
And are those dealing with the linear bone?
The linear fracture, yes, sir.
Linear fracture.
Yes, sir.
Are they fair and accurate photos of Dr. Knowles' autopsy?
Yes, sir.
Offer 333 and 334.
If I could see them, that'd be great. Objection.
Received, publication granted.
Thank you. Doctor, would you come down here again? And with these two exhibits, 333 and 334, would you explain to the jury why you believe that it's not a pre-existing fracture?
I'm going to go out of numerical order, but this is 334. This is taken from a little farther away than 333. So just to set the scene, the large area of skull bone in the upper left here is the majority of the so-called skull cap, the large piece of skull from the top that gets taken off to expose the brain and allow the brain to be removed, and also then subsequently to see the base of the skull. To the way the picture is oriented on the screen, going downward predominantly and slightly to the right, there's another fairly large, roughly triangular fracture fragment, and then some smaller fracture fragments to the right. If we look at 333, I've just taken the zoom down a little bit, and you can see that this is, a slightly closer up view of the same area of bone, the same bone specimens that were in 334. And I'm now going to zoom back in a bit. Here off to our right of the photo as displayed, you can see partial circumference of the entrance gunshot wound. You can see now these bone fragments here on the right side and down to lower.
Let me interrupt you a minute. Up there where you just put the pen, right there, is that where the gunshot, where the bullet entered?
That is part of the circumference of where the bullet entered, yes.
Okay.
And you'll see that these fragments are laying on the exam table So there's some separation among them where the fracture lines are, so they're not perfectly in their configuration because the fractures don't allow the fragments to hold together. It's the nature of a fragment, the nature of a fracture. But you can see emanating from the area of the entrance wound, and this was also true in the 331 and 332 that we saw when we were looking at the base of the skull relative to the temporal bone fracture, that from the point of the entrance gunshot wound on the left side of the forehead, numerous fractures of the skull bone emanated and radiated. Some of them went to the front parts of the skull that we saw, and the other ones, both actually left and right. Many of them traversed backwards on the left side of the skull, and indeed, from that area, there are numerous irregular fracture lines that I'm outlining with the pen tip here, and they've separated various fragments, and some of them from the area of the gunshot wound are continuously going down to the far end, the way we've oriented here. Have continuously and contiguously extended out here, which is toward the rear, left rear. And in fact, that's the area that Dr. Mills designated as the pre-existing linear fracture, saying that these other fractures terminated or arrested on it. And in reality, or in my opinion, I should say, excuse me, you see multiple fractures going in multiple directions, causing various fragmentation, some of which include causing this line of fracture, the so-called linear fracture. So in my opinion, the linear fracture was one of many fractures that arose from the entrance gunshot wound, and the fact that other fractures went up to that line does not indicate in this instance that this was a pre-existing fracture, but rather that there were multiple fractures going in multiple directions, going toward the back, and intersecting and fragmenting the skull bone, all of which arose from the entrance gunshot wound.
Thank you, Doctor. Doctor, going back just for a second to your opinion that this was an accidental self-inflicted gunshot wound, did you find any factors at all that would indicate that it was a homicide, that it was a death caused by another person?
No, sir.
That's all I have.
Thank you. Mr. Kaiser.
Thank you, Your Honor. Doctor, I've handed you Exhibit 329, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
That's your curriculum vitae, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
You told us that in your curriculum vitae from April of '98 till October of '03, you were the chief medical examiner of Washington, D.C., is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that's a federal office, because Washington, D.C. is federal government, is that correct?
No, sir.
So your office was part of the city government of the city of Washington?
Yes, sir.
And also the District of Columbia, is that right?
That's the same, sir.
Thank you. In fact, in October of 2003, you resigned from that position, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you resigned from that position after the District of Columbia Inspector General's office concluded that your office had failed in its basic mission, the prompt and complete investigation of unexpected deaths. Is that correct?
That was their conclusion.
And in fact, part of the facts that led up to that conclusion was that the cause and manner of death for roughly 400 people who had died since 1999 were pending, and the details of their demise was left unresolved, right?
Yes, sir.
So in terms of whether or not your review of this matter is a complete one, do you still have your document dated January 29th, 2020 with you?
Yes, sir. Exhibit 330.
And it's entitled A Report of a Consultation, correct?
It's entitled Report of Consultation.
So it's not entitled Investigation, is that right?
Correct.
The consulting work that you've done since you've had your consulting forensic pathology and business has been consulting work for which you're paid in each case, is that correct?
Yes, I am paid for my professional work.
And in this case, you started out with a retainer fee of $1,500, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And then you were billing your hourly work on this case at $550 an hour, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
How many hours have you billed so far?
I don't know how many have actually been billed since I don't do the billing. I know that I put in about 9.5 hours total before today.
And on today's date, you are going to be billing a flat rate of $5,500, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So it'll be $1,500 plus $5,500 plus $550 times 9.5 plus whatever is above the 9.5, is that correct?
No, sir. The $1,500 retainer is not in addition. The initial hours are worked against that. That's not an additional fee.
Got it. So in other words, once the $550 per hour goes above $1,500, then we're just working the hourly.
Yes, sir.
All right. So when we talk about manner of death, tell us what the choices are.
The choices for a manner of death are natural, accident, homicide, suicide, and undetermined.
Whenever in today's proceeding you've been asked for your opinion or you've told us it was your opinion, has that opinion been offered to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes, sir.
Amongst the factors you used to achieve that level of certainty, you said were a report regarding gunshot residue, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
How many of those did you review?
I don't have them with me, so I don't recall exactly.
And they're also not listed as materials reviewed in Exhibit 330, correct?
You're correct. I believe they came to me later and it served to strengthen my opinion.
Oh, I understand that, but just, we know they're not listed here.
Correct, sir.
And you didn't do a supplemental report of consultation indicating your additional review of any records.
That's correct, sir.
And you also said that you reviewed DNA testing. Do you know what it was you looked at?
I do not recall the exact report. I recall the essence of the results of the report.
Do you recall who the report was of or from where?
I'm not sure I understand. I mean, from where, I don't remember exactly which lab did the DNA work. I remember it was DNA testing indicative of what was recovered from the muzzle of the gun.
In any event, in your terms of the report of your consultation, the DNA testing is not listed, is that right?
Correct, sir.
You mentioned you mentioned Chase Fleischauer's intoxication 4 times as a significant factor in your talk with us today. Do you remember that?
I didn't keep count, but I do remember citing it as an important factor.
No, 4 times. If you said it here 4 times, that would seem like in your mind it's a pretty big deal, correct?
I think it is an important factor, yes, sir.
And one of the things you said about it was it has an impairment of fine motor skills, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
You also said it has an impairment of judgment, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
You're a forensic pathologist, so most of the time you deal with dead people, right?
In terms of who I examine or consult on, mostly, not entirely, but mostly.
All right. But this is an opinion about how .278 would influence a living, breathing person, correct?
Well, it's entirely within the purview of forensic pathology. Among the various things that you're required to do as a forensic pathologist is to interpret the effects of diseases and injuries, including intoxications on people, in part because if you don't know as a physician what those things, what the effects are of those things on human activity, then you're not able to make the ultimate conclusion that you're charged with, which is, did this or did this not cause death? So intoxication is a frequent topic of analysis in forensic pathology.
What would a blood alcohol count of 0.44 do to a person's judgment?
Well, first of all, answering the question of what would any given blood alcohol concentration do to any given person depends in part on that person's experience with alcohol. But as a fair generalization, a 0.44, which is a very high blood alcohol concentration, is likely to cause significant and severe impairment of judgment of most people under most circumstances. It's a high enough blood alcohol concentration that you're now into the realm of what is potentially lethal.
And it certainly could impair how one might go about handling a firearm.
Yes, sir.
If we assume for purposes of this conversation that Chase Fleischauer's arm length from shoulder to the tip of his index finger was 31 inches. With me so far?
Yes, sir.
And you saw that in the autopsy report?
I did.
Right. Then it's your position that he would be able to take the pistol, turn it in his hand by accident, aim it at himself, and come within 5 to 6 inches. Is that your position?
My position that it is physically consistent or possible for him to hold that weapon and shoot himself from that distance and that location at that trajectory. Exactly how he's holding the weapon would not be limited to the way that you demonstrated. I do not believe that it is inconsistent with him holding it the way you were demonstrating, although he could have been holding that weapon in different ways. He could hold it in essentially backwards. He could have any one of a number of fingers, including his thumb on the trigger. So yes, there are ways in which it is entirely consistent with his 31-inch arm length receiving that gunshot wound as an accidental self-inflicted wound.
But other than that, it's physically possible. You have no other basis upon which to say that that was what happened.
Well, I disagree, sir. I think the basis of my opinion as to what happened, or really how it happened, which is manner of death, is the entirety of the response that I gave earlier.
Okay.
It's all those factors in combination.
And we can break that down a little bit more, but my question is this. Whether or not Chase Fleichauer could have held the pistol 5 to 6 inches away from his head doesn't foreclose, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, another person holding the pistol 5 to 6 inches away from his head. Isn't that correct?
Object to that as not in evidence, Your Honor.
Sustained as to the form.
Do you have page 5 of Exhibit 330 there in front of you?
Yes, sir.
Couple lines up from the bottom of the last large paragraph. Did you write the following to a reasonable degree of medical certainty? It is at least as likely that the gunshot wound to Chase was self-inflicted as it was inflicted by another, comma, and in my opinion, more likely. Is that what you wrote?
Yes, sir.
All right. And it's my understanding that Exhibit 330 is in evidence. If I'm wrong, someone can correct me, but assuming that's correct, then my question to you is this. Another person could hold the pistol pointed at Chase's head 5 to 6 inches away. Is that correct?
Object to that as lack of evidence in the case.
Overruled, it's a matter of weight if any of the jury gives it. Assuming that those facts, Doctor, do you have an opinion?
Yes, Your Honor.
And could another person hold the pistol 5 to 6 inches away from Chase's head?
That is physically possible.
In fact, you talked earlier about contact wounds being more consistent with suicide, but another person could hold a pistol to a person's head and cause a contact wound and cause death. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, the review of the video that you attribute, you call it a ballistics test report, parenthesis, recoil with videos from Corey R. Burton. Do you see that at the bottom of page 1 of Exhibit 330?
Yes, sir.
And on page 3 of Exhibit 330, you relied, as you testified here, on the gun being, on the assumption that the gun was being, the word you and Mr. Burton used, loosely held. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if that was an assumption. That was one of the potential factors that explains the findings.
Do you recall in Mr. Burton's report that he had to tighten the grip on the pistol in order for it to cycle all the way through? In other words, fire the gun, eject the shell casing, and chamber around.
Yes, he had to tighten it relative to the degree of looseness that he started with in his experiments, yes.
Jerry, what's been marked as Exhibits 169 and 321, do you recognize those being the gunshot residue reports that you received? Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Excuse me, yes, sir.
And you physically reviewed those documents. It wasn't related to you orally, is that correct?
That's my recollection. I did actually review these documents, yes, sir.
So in 169, the document that identified GSR as being present on Chase Fleischauer's hand, you also reviewed what is termed in the document from the company that did the testing, the qualifiers. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And the qualifiers that you reviewed told you that GSR can be deposited on a person if they discharge the firearm, are in the proximity of discharging a firearm, or come in contact with an object that has GSR on it. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
You also reviewed a qualifier that said two of the components and one of the component particles that were found on Chase are found in GSR, but may also originate from other sources. You reviewed that qualifier as well. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you also reviewed the qualifier that told you that the absence of GSR does not eliminate the possibility that the person handled or discharged a firearm. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you've reviewed GSR reports in the past, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you know that as you use this information, that these particles are microscopic. They can't be seen by the human eye. Is that right?
Object to this is lack of foundation, Your Honor.
If you know, Doctor.
Yes, sir. I do know that. That's correct.
Turning to the qualifiers in Exhibit 321, where, as you know, the test results showed no GSR from the Q-tip swabs taken from Summer Johnson Fleischauer and Kayle Fleischauer. You reviewed the qualifiers which say that GSR can be deposited by circumstances such as discharging a firearm, being in the proximity of discharging a firearm, or coming into contact with a surface or object with GSR on it. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you also reviewed the qualifier that said two component and one component particles are found in GSR, but may also originate from other sources. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you also reviewed the qualifier that told you that the absence of GSR does not eliminate the possibility that the subject handled or discharged the firearm. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Based on your experience with gunshot residue, does your experience tell you that these fine microscopic particles are fragile and can easily be wiped off?
I don't know about fragile. The gunshot residue particles can be wiped off. That is true.
So, one of the factors that did not play a role in your decision is the factor regarding the placement where the firearm was found. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And the reason that you take the position that that fact is not a factor in your decision is because, and if you turn to page 4 of Exhibit 330,
Yes, sir.
it was your position that although it was variously described as being 10 feet or 12 to 15 feet away, there was considerable activity about his body both before and after law enforcement arrived on the scene. Is that right?
That is part of my report in that regard, yes, sir.
And you took the position that, and I quote, "We do not have any firm documentation of where the gun came to rest relative to his body immediately after he received the gunshot." That's your position, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So, amongst the things you don't list as materials reviewed are the police reports. Is that right?
Yes, sir. Other than the criminal complaint, if that counts as a police report.
I'll leave it to the court to decide whether a complaint filed with the court is a police report or not, but the fact is that you didn't review the police reports.
Correct, sir.
And the only crime lab report that you reviewed that you are orally telling us about now is the DNA report. Is that correct?
Other than the gunshot residues, yes, sir.
Good point. So the gunshot residue reports came from RJ Lee Company, right?
Yes, sir.
And you're not aware what other lab the DNA reports came from?
I do not recall.
And whatever lab that came from, that's the DNA report is the only report from that lab that you reviewed. Is that correct?
Well, since I don't remember which lab it was, it's hard to answer that question.
Okay. Another thing you don't list in your materials reviewed are the photographs taken by the St. Croix County, Wisconsin medical examiner. Is that correct?
Which photographs are we talking about?
Well, the only photographs you have listed that you looked at are the autopsy photographs of Chase Fleichauer and the PowerPoint presentation by Dr. Mills, which incorporated some of those same photographs. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. So you didn't look at the scene photographs taken at the scene by the St. Croix County medical examiner?
Correct.
Nor did you review the police reports of the officers describing their documentation of where the gun was found by them, correct?
Correct. Again, other than the criminal complaint.
And you didn't review the photographs taken by the Wisconsin State Crime Lab at the scene?
Correct.
You didn't review the photographs taken by the first officer who photographed at the scene?
Correct, sir.
You didn't review the video recording taken by the crime lab at the scene? By the Wisconsin State Crime Lab?
Correct, sir.
But what we do know from your report, Doctor, again on page 4, is that, as you say, the gunshot wound to the brain would likely incapacitate him immediately. As such, he would lose the ability to conduct purposeful action, and one would expect the gun to drop in close proximity to him, correct?
Yes, sir.
You also didn't listen to or review any of the audio recordings from this case, in other words, from the 911 call or from the police officers arriving at the scene, correct?
Correct, sir.
As such, you don't have, as a factor in considering your opinion, Summer Fleischauer's statement that she saw no gun by Chase, correct?
Well, unless that information was incorporated into the criminal complaint. But other than that, correct, sir.
he would, Chase Fleichauer was incapacitated immediately, you wrote, right?
Yes, sir.
And if I'm wrong, correct me. It would be fair to say that he went down where he was and stayed there, correct?
In terms of the effects of the gunshot wound, yes, it is correct. The introductory sentence you read from my page 4 was that I would expect the gun to drop in proximity, and then I go on to describe other potential factors to consider in that regard. And I would expect his body to drop, collapse at the point of the gunshot wound. And you said wouldn't move. Again, he would not move significantly on his own power thereafter. He might have some twitching or convulsion or something, but he wouldn't move himself to a different location or position, although of course that doesn't preclude movement of his body by external forces.
Just so I'm clear, other than twitching and convulsions or being moved by a different person, he wouldn't be standing, walking.
Oh, that's correct, sir.
Showing you from Exhibit 149, Exhibit 144D. Do you remember viewing that photograph as part of Dr. Mills' PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
He has to republish to the jury.
Granted.
Do you recall that being a photograph identifying that as the bottoms of Chase's socks? Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Has to publish 114 to the jury.
Granted.
Does how those socks looked in 144D, which was part of 149, appear to be consistent with what's been admitted in evidence here as Exhibit 114 from the crime scene?
Yes, it does.
So the blood on the bottom of his socks would not be consistent with having occurred after he was shot, correct?
That is correct, sir.
So in terms of the injuries that he received from the fight before he was shot, they...
Object to that term fight, Your Honor.
Sustained as to the form of the question.
When, if ever, in your profession prior to today, have you had to distinguish between a fight and a wrestling match?
I can't recall another specific episode in which I had to make such a distinction.
Why are you making it today?
I don't think I did.
They're the same thing, aren't they?
I didn't.
Judge, I object.
Careful.
Argumentative.
Whoa. Careful in arguing, Mr. Kaiser. Question.
Thank you. So today, you haven't distinguished what's been termed a wrestling match from a fight. Isn't that correct?
I haven't made any comment on this issue whatsoever. I didn't make the objection.
what you told us, and correct me if I'm wrong, what you told us was that you could not form an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty whether or not the injuries that Chase Fleichauer sustained prior to the shooting occurred seconds, minutes, or even as much as a day before his death. Is that correct?
I said there was no medical evidence on which to distinguish whether these acute or fresh injuries occurred at any place in that realm of the time frame. I said that it could have happened seconds, minutes, or hours before his death, some of them conceivably up to a day. I said they could have occurred at the same time, but there's no medical basis to say that they did occur at the same time.
No medical basis.
Yes, sir.
You haven't looked at any pictures, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. You haven't looked at any photos of Chase Fleichauer taken that evening, have you?
Correct.
So there could be a basis, other than a medical basis, for folks who've seen those pictures to find approximately when those injuries occurred. Isn't that
Object
right?
to that, Your Honor, is lack of foundation.
Calls for speculation, Mr. Kaiser, sustained.
Would those injuries that you've reviewed photographs of, that you've termed acute or fresh injuries, be consistent with Chase Fleichauer having been in a fight?
Yes, sir.
Has to publish 144O and P from 149.
Granted.
Doctor, can you see 144O from 149 up on the screen?
Yes, sir.
And we're going to get the lights, Mr. Kaiser.
I appreciate you. You've seen these photos in the PowerPoint, is that correct?
I have.
If we accept the proposition that this is a hair, which is what Dr. Mills said right here, this black mark. Oh.
Yes, sir.
Is that okay? Looking down then at, I'm in the light, that's helping. Looking down then to this line here, do you see she has that marked linear skull fracture?
Yes, sir.
And that's the linear skull fracture you and Mr. Gray were discussing earlier, is that correct?
It is.
All right. Now, that linear skull fracture runs more or less at an angle across the skull above the left ear, is that right?
Well, roughly. I mean, it's not immediately above the left ear, but it's in that region.
And tell me if I'm wrong, but what we see is a fracture here and here, at least, that run into that linear skull fracture, is that correct?
From this view, which is the outside of the skull, I'm seeing the linear skull fracture, which indeed is what Dr. Mills labeled here. I don't see her labeling another fracture.
Okay.
Now, the internal view of the skull was much better in terms of seeing the multiple fractures intersecting. They're not all visible from the external view in this photo.
One thing that 144.0 from Exhibit 149 from Dr. Mills' PowerPoint shows us is the relationship of the entrance wound, which she has labeled, to the linear skull fracture that we were just looking at, correct?
Relationship in terms of their relative locations on the skull? Yes.
Correct. Thank you. In, as you said, the general vicinity of the left ear is where one of the terminuses, one of the endpoints of the linear skull fracture is. Is that correct?
Well, no, actually, you said above the left ear, and I said vaguely, I don't think I used that term, pardon me, but
Okay.
generally, but not directly above the left ear.
Correct.
And in fact, the left temporal bone fracture is much more closely related to the left ear if you wanted to make that connection.
All right. In any event, that linear skull fracture isn't radiating from the point of the entrance, is it?
Well, in this photograph, which doesn't show all the fractures, it doesn't show the connection. The photographs that we showed in evidence earlier that Dr. Mills took of the inside of the skull cap, in fact, do show the connection.
Showing you 144P of Exhibit 149. Does that give us a better idea of where the two endpoints are of the linear skull fracture?
Again, endpoints as you can see them on the outer surface of the skull, not the totality of those fractures and the fractures that it's related to, which are much better demonstrated on the inside photographs.
You said that you reviewed her drawing, is that correct?
The diagrams.
Her diagram of the skull fractures?
One of her diagrams included at least some of the skull fractures.
Judge asked to publish the third page of 152.
Yes.
So, Doctor, assuming Dr. Mills tested, you said you read her transcript, right?
Yes, sir.
From this week, last week?
Yes, sir.
So, assuming Dr. Mills testified that this line here is the linear fracture that we've been discussing, and that hole here is the entrance wound, the linear fracture goes perpendicular to the other fractures coming out of the entrance wound, isn't that correct?
In the diagram, roughly so, yes. I'm relying more on the photographs, which I think more accurately demonstrated those fractures and the fragmentation.
Did you find any of the fractures that ran perpendicular to the linear fracture below the linear fracture in your examination of the photographs?
No, sir.
So the fractures that run perpendicular to the linear fracture stop or terminate at the linear fracture, is that correct?
Based on the photographs, I'm not convinced that they stop there, that the linear fracture is actually a separate fracture. To me, it is incorporated in the totality of the fragmentation of that area arising from the entrance gunshot wound.
And what I asked you earlier was, do any of the fractures that run perpendicular to the linear fracture go beyond it?
Object, Your Honor. He should also mention that it's the drawing, it's not the actual.
Well, again, I didn't find the question to be related to the drawing. I think the question was asked of the doctor based on his examination of photos or otherwise, doctor, so answer with that understanding.
Yes, Your Honor. Again, relying on the photographs rather than the diagram, showing the actual anatomy. No, there were no fractures that crossed it, but there were fractures that propagated into it, and in my opinion, it is an extension of those fractures.
For those fractures to propagate into it, it would have to be there first.
No, that's not the case.
In the thing that you termed the Corey Burton video recording, as you reviewed it and concluded to use it in your discussion here today, how, if in any way, did you find the way in which the pistol was held by the thing that was holding the pistol in the video to be close to a human person?
It doesn't reproduce the grip of a human hand. It wasn't a bionic hand kind of thing. It was a mechanical device to hold the pistol with a certain amount of tension and to allow the pistol to be fired without otherwise being supported or clamped into a vise or something like that. So I think it was a reproduction of some degree of tension holding the pistol, but it wasn't meant to be, and it certainly wasn't an actual recreation of a human hand.
So, based on those things you did review, you found, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, no compelling evidence that Chase was shot by another person. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. But what you started out telling us was that in your part-time work, you conduct what you termed death investigations. Is that right?
The process of the function of a medical examiner is medical legal death investigation. So between what the forensic pathologist personally does and relying on other entities, including within the agency, there is an investigation into the circumstances of death, there is an examination of the decedent, and then there's a synthesis of those findings into conclusions as to cause and manner of death, which is what I do when I was and when I am employed by a government, and it's a very similar process in terms of reviewing a case as a consultant.
And in your opinion, in this case, you've done a complete review of the circumstances of the death to reach your conclusion?
I've done a sufficient thorough review of the necessary elements to reach my conclusions and support them.
And my question was it a complete review?
I don't know what complete review means. Have I sought every single possible fact regarding the shooting and the circumstance that's in the universe? No. Have I been complete in the sense of I have sufficient evidence on which to base conclusions? Yes.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take our mid-morning break or recess. Don't form any opinion, any discussion, search, or deliberations. We'll figure about 10 minutes. When you're ready, we'll be ready. Thank you. Take the jury out, please.
All rise.
Figure about 25 up, counsel. Thank you.
What was that, Your Honor?
Figure about 25 to